This is the third time that we've done one of these WebEx sessions, and I like to start them all off the same way. The first thing that I'm going to show you as I do my demonstration on the use of the requirement waiver exception is how to be working with any exception type and also be in a space where you can be easily running degree audits and not have any issues with the system timing you out on pages or causing you to have to do too much work and being able to work at two places at the same time. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you how I would approach working on exceptions in the Catalyst system. Right now I've logged into the Catalyst system and I'm going to go up here to the top of my screen, the upper left-hand corner, and I'm going to use what we call the breadcrumbs to navigate to our exceptions page. And the way that I'm doing that is I'm going to Campus Solutions, Academic Advisement, Student Advisement, and then I'm going to click on the link for Authorized Student Exceptions. This takes me to the page where I can create exceptions for the student. It is the same page that you are accustomed to seeing if you're navigating here through the portal links that you find when you first log into the system. Now that I have my page set up for the authorized student exceptions page, I also want to go ahead and go sort of towards the top right-hand corner of my screen and open up a new window in the system. I'm then going to use the breadcrumbs again to navigate to the Advisor Center by clicking on Campus Solutions, Self-Service, Advisor Center, and then I can click any of these links really that I want to. If you click My Advisees, it's going to take you to that list of your advisees that you see when you first click on the Advisor Center headed in from the portal. And these are just the links that you'll find in the Advisor Center. So the academics is the space that you see in the Advisor Center that has all the students' program plan stacks and has some term metrics displayed. General information is where you go and see the students' bio-demo data, any student groups that they're associated with. The Student Center is actually the page where you can access the academics menu dropdown and be able to run the degree audit. And transfer credit is where you go and see the students' transfer modules that they have assigned to them. So I'm just going to click on Advisee Student Center. All of these options are going to take you to a search page where you're going to need to enter in information about your student. The first thing that I did was I went ahead and remembered to hit delete so I could take the period out of the ID column. That has a very specific purpose for being there. If it wasn't there and you clicked search, it would search all of the students in UC's database, and that's often not the outcome that you're looking for, and it would be sort of timely to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and type in the name of a student that I'd like to work with and select that student. Now I'm looking at the Student Center page for this student, and usually when you're making any kind of exception, the first action that we see advisors and faculty members taking is they go in and they run the degree audit. So I'm going to click on the academic requirements link for this student, and I'm going to hit the go button. This is going to run the student's default program. It's going to bring up all of the active programs that this student has and display them in an audit report by career. So as I scroll down, I see this student's information for their program here. I see their audit. And the first thing that I see is some open space that I might want to use for this demonstration. So I'm going to focus on this English composition requirement here at the top. And I'm going to say, for the purposes of our demonstration, what I'd like to do is I would like to go ahead and I would like to waive this intermediate composition requirement that the student has for the student. So from here, I'm going to go back over to my Authorized Student Exceptions tab, and I'm going to select to add a new value. When I do this, I'm going to see the assessment override number already populated with all zeros. This means that the system is going to generate a number for this exception. There's nothing that you need to do here. For those of you who have been making exceptions, we did our first two presentations on course directive and on requirement change. And the process on the first screen of your exception is the same for requirement waiver that it is for requirement change or requirement override or course directive. So there's some information that we have to tell the system about the exception that we're writing for the student. And it's kind of broken up into two sections. So the first section just gives us an opportunity to define the effective date. The effective date tells the system when this particular exception should go into effect for the student. So as a general rule, it's okay to just leave the date that is populated in the effective date window, unless there are some other circumstances that would cause you to change it. It's always populated with the date that you're creating the exception. And what that means is from the point that you say okay and save your exception, the exception will be live in the audit system, and you'll begin to see that reflected once you run the student's audit again. There is a status at the top. The status allows for us to indicate if the exception should be active or inactive. So an active exception is one that you're going to see processing in the degree audit system. Anything that's marked as inactive, you're going to have a record of that exception being created at some point in time, but as of the effective date, that exception will no longer be processing in the audit system. So one way that we would potentially see a status marked inactive is if an advisor or faculty member was proactively working with a student and created an exception for them. Maybe they were going to waive a category in the student's audit as long as they had completed a course or completed a certain action by a certain date and time. If the student failed to do that, you could still keep the record that the exception had been created, but by marking the status as inactive, you would no longer see that exception applying to the student's degree audit. The description field here at the top is simply for the purposes of being able to track the exception by advisors who would be working with students that have lots and lots of exceptions. It's a required field, and you do need to put something in this space. We recommend that you put something in there that's going to help you to remember, particularly for those students that have more than one exception, what this exception does or where this exception applies to. So for this, for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to say waive intermediate comp. So if I ever have to come back to this exception now and I search for the student, as I'll show you how to do at the end of the demo, if the student has more than one exception, I can look at this description and I can get a good idea before even clicking on it what this exception is doing within the degree audit. The short description is not a field that you have to worry about. It's not one that is required, and it doesn't really hold a lot of value in terms of an advisor or faculty member being able to search for the exception, and it doesn't do anything on the student's end either. So it's okay to leave that blank if you'd like. You have a limited number of characters that you can use in the description field. You also have an even more limited number of characters that you can use in the short description field. So if you do choose to populate that, just know that I think you're limited in that space to just a handful of characters. So there's not going to be a lot that you can put in there. Now, the requirement waiver exception is unique in a number of different ways, but one important way that it's unique is that the long description that you provide is presented to the student on both the web and also on the PDF version of the degree audit. Most of the exception types that you'll work with will perform the action associated with the exception on the web version, but may suppress the description by having the student have to click on a hyperlink, or if it's the case of a requirement change, may suppress the description once the requirement or the requirement line has been completed. In this case, the requirement waiver is always going to display the long description on the web just as you've typed it, and it's not going to be suppressed in any way. The student doesn't need to click on anything in order to reference that. So, it's a good opportunity for you to communicate important things about the exception or things that'll be helpful for people who read the audit to understand why the exception was made. So I'm going to say waived for the student through demonstrated competency. Okay, so the next thing that we need to provide for our exception is as we look just under the override details header, we'll notice that there's a space for us to indicate the student's career program plan stack that we would like this exception to apply to. The reason that we do this is because Catalyst gives us the ability to display multiple programs in the degree audit report by career. So if I am a student that has an open 4-year program and a minor and a certificate, we now have the luxury of being able to see all of those things kind of stacked out in the same space. Darwin didn't provide us with that same opportunity. Because of that, though, we have a need to be able to indicate, particularly for a requirement like English composition that could be repeated across multiple programs, which program we want this exception to apply to. So if you are not yet familiar with some of the codes associated with the programs that you're working with, you can always go back to the Advisor Center. I'm just going to do this real quickly by clicking on my Advisor Center tab and click on the Academics tab. The Academics tab is going to display information for you. And so the first bit of detail that I see here are the links that show the student's program. So in this case, the student had one program. We can see on the status here, it's been discontinued. And go to the next one, we see that this is the active program. Remember, in the beginning of the demonstration, I said only the active programs are going to be displayed. So we know in this case, this is the plan that we want to use for our exception. So a little quick tip just to help you if you're creating lots of exceptions in a row is that you always have the ability to go directly to the plan level and to begin to fill in your value. Just double check my code here. So I type my plan code in and hit tab, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to fill in the program and career that are associated with that plan. You can't do that at the subplan level. It doesn't backfill like that. It only backfills for the plan. But what you can do is if you know you're working with a program that has a subplan, you can go ahead and type in the plan code, let it backfill, and then if there are any associated subplans, you can use your lookup window here in order to select those codes as well. And it's going to use this plan value to only present you with subplans that are connected to that plan. So you're not going to see lots of extra information. You're just going to see the stuff that's associated with the CPP stack that you're indicating. In this case, we're only looking at a program that has a plan, and I can verify that again by looking at the academic program data that's held on this academics tab within the Advisor Center. If there was a subplan, I would see a subplan listed here, sort of just below plan, but that is not the case. So the next thing that I need is the student's EMPL ID, and I'm going to use a trick. I'm just going to go ahead and click Return to Search in the Advisor Center. It takes me back to my search window, and my student's EMPL ID is already there. It's kind of a helpful trick in case you, don't have the M number of the student offhand and you don't have the EMPL ID of the student offhand. If you've just searched for the student based on their name, you can go ahead and do that, and then you just click Search, and it takes you right back into the Student Center. Or I'm sorry, to the Advisor Center for that student. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in the student's EMPL ID. The last thing that I need to do on this screen is I need to indicate our operation code, which in this case, we're working with a requirement waiver. So I'm going to go ahead and select that option. You'll see that there are 4 other options that you can find in this same space. We have 5 exception types that we work with, and you'd have to go to a different page for course substitution. And you can learn more about course substitution at our next WebEx presentation. It'll be very specific to that particular exception type. So once we select the operation code for requirement waiver, we need to make a decision about the level that we're wanting to make the waiver at. And so if I'm looking at the student's degree audit, and I'll go ahead and run that quickly here, there are 3 different levels that you need to be aware of. And if you're looking at the web audit, they're easy to distinguish visually. Anything that is displayed with a black banner here is called a requirement group. So we have a requirement group for every program that we have at UC. And then we also have some requirement groups that are associated with some generic components of the audit, like in this case, the disclaimer and there's a section at the bottom that presents some universal information for the student. But for the most part, your association for a requirement group should be the word program, because there is a one-to-one relationship between the requirement group and a program that's running in the degree audit system. So in this case, this particular program is at the group level, and I can visually distinguish that because it's presented in this black banner sort of towards the top of the audit. It's also good to know that, because if you have a student who's running multiple programs, you can figure out very easily where one program stops and the next program starts by making that connection. Where's the next banner that indicates the start of a new requirement group? That's going to be the start of your new program. So the next visual cue that you see within a program's audit is that there underneath the program, there are a lot of things presented to you in sort of a light gray banner, and in this case, English composition requirement is one of those items. So anything that you see in a light gray banner, these are sort of larger groupings of requirements within the student's program, and they are called requirements for the system's purpose. Underneath each of these requirements, and you can see the student has quite a few here, you'll see some text and a status occasionally, and some course lists that are next to green arrows. For each green arrow, we have what we call a requirement line. So as far as this particular program is set up, we know that the requirement group is pre-business association. The requirement is English composition requirement, and this particular requirement has two lines. It has a line for English composition, and it has a line for intermediate composition. So as we're making our exception for this demo, we only want to waive the intermediate composition requirement. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to select the requirement line level, because that is the level that intermediate composition exists at. It's next to the green triangle, and the green triangle indicates requirement line. So it's green triangle is requirement line, gray banner is requirement, and black banner is requirement group. The level information is really important as you're making this type of exception, because if you make a requirement waiver, everything that exists underneath that waiver is going to be waived. So if your level is requirement group, you're going to waive all of the requirements and all of the lines that exist in that requirement group, because they exist under the structure of requirement group. That's sort of the overarching. Programs have requirements and requirements have detail. So it's going to waive all of those requirements and it's going to waive all of those lines. The requirement, so again, if you're making a requirement waiver and you're saying that the level is requirement, all of the lines that exist underneath that requirement are going to get waived. Okay, so in this case, if we wanted to make a requirement level waiver and we chose the English composition requirement, it's going to waive the English composition line and it's going to waive the intermediate composition line, because it's going to go ahead and it's going to waive everything that exists underneath the requirement banner that you're indicating, all the way down to the next requirement. The next requirement is going to be unaffected by what you're creating, but everything in between is going to get waived. So the line level is the lowest level. It's probably the most common that we're going to see indicated when making this particular type of exception, because in most cases, we're not interested in waiving out whole requirements of the student's program. We're just interested in waiving portions of that requirement based on the different characteristics and the different things that the students bring to the table. So like I said before, because we're just interested in waiving the intermediate composition, that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on that requirement line. So I have that indicated here as well. And before I move on to the second screen, I want to go ahead and say that in making this type of exception, and we've said this before with course directive, and we've said this with requirement change, and I know that you hear it in your training, but I want to make sure that we say it again. When you're determining your selection code and your selection data, you typically want to always select student as your selection code. There are some other options that you'll find underneath this heading: student group, program, and plan. But we don't train on how to use these, and they're very heavy-handed types of exceptions, so we advocate not using them. If you want to make a broader change, something that would affect everyone in a student group, something that would affect everyone that's in a plan or a program, contact your encoder. That's the best way to go about making that type of change because they can encode those details to happen based on the presence of that plan, based on the presence of that program, or based on the presence of that student group, and then no exception is needed. And you can just use those things as you would normally use them without any impact. So it's the same result, but it's a little safer in that your encoder can make sure that there's no other consequences to making that type of exception. Sometimes we see people make a mistake and click a selection code that isn't student, and the next thing you know, they've waived all of this requirement for people in a particular plan, and that wasn't their intention. So um, we say all the time, just use the selection code of student. Don't select anything other than that. So the way to get to the next piece of this is to go ahead and click that blue link for create exception. You filled in all that data on the first part of your screen, and now you can move on to telling the system what space in your waiver, in your audit, that you want the waiver to impact. So these requirement line to waive cue off of the detail that you gave the exception on the first screen that you completed. They're only going to allow you in your search options to pick requirement groups and requirements and requirement lines that are associated with the CPP stack that you've indicated. It's not going to give you any other types of options than that. And depending on the level that you've selected, you're only going to see down to the requirement line level if you've selected line, down to the requirement level if you've selected requirement, and down to the group level if you've selected group. And that's kind of a helpful check. So if you're going through and you're creating the exception quickly, and then you get to the second screen and all you see is requirement group, you may have forgot to change the level because group is what it defaults to. So you can always go back if that's the case just by clicking cancel. It'll take you back to that first screen and you can change the level and then click create exception again, and it'll have your fields corresponding to the new level that you've chosen. So in this case, we see down to the line number, which is good for us. We're going to go ahead and select a requirement group because we indicated the CPP stack that we did. We see that there is only one group for this particular program. Usually that's going to be the case. You're only going to see one group. Sometimes we've made some adjustments for different populations that exist within the same group. Honors is a pretty popular one for us. So if your program has different requirements based on whether or not the student is or is not in honors, we may have made two requirement groups, but when we've done that, we've been very specific in the detail that we present to say which group is which. So if there were, multiple here, you would have one that says pre-business, and then you'd have one that says pre-business honors. So you always have a description that helps you to pick the appropriate group if there's more than one. Typically, there is only one group, though. So once we've selected our group, like I said, everything is sort of triggering off of the selections that we've already made. Now, all of a sudden, I can use the search window for requirement, and I'm only going to see the requirements that exist within the requirement group that I've selected. The descriptions help me to determine from multiple requirements, which is the appropriate one for me to select. In this case, I know I want to make a change to the English composition requirement. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this first requirement that says ENGL comp. And I'm going to then go to the line number, use the search window again to be able to see what options exist underneath this. Now, depending on the way that your college was created by your encoder, you might see a course title here, you might see the course, but in any case, you're probably going to see something that makes it very easy for you to determine between the lines that you're presented, which is the line that you would want to choose for the action that you're doing. In this case, I know that intermediate composition, as we indicate on the audit, is ENGL 2089, and that's what the description tells me this line is. So it's easy enough for me to choose to select that particular line number. Now, occasionally, when you are looking at your line detail, you might see that there are several lines, some of which say the word hidden in them. Those are typically not lines that you want to be writing exceptions to, because the hidden lines are ones that programs have indicated for us that they'd like some audit processing to occur in an automated fashion, but not to be presented to a student until they have the detail associated with that line. So if there's a course that your program will accept, but it's not the course that you would hope students would want, would take, we can put that behind the scenes, so that you don't have to write an exception for it each time the student has it, if it's something that you're always going to take. But we use a print control that keeps that hidden so that until the student has it as part of their record, they're unaware that it's there and processing, but it will just replace the line that it's connected with. So in general, you just want to pick things that have normal course titles, that have, regular course subject and numbers listed. If you see anything that's kind of in the background there, you can go ahead and just move to the next thing. So in this case, we have everything that we need. We've indicated the group, the requirement, the line. What this tells me is that in the pre-business administration group, in the English composition requirement, I want to waive this requirement line for ENGL 2089, which matches what our expectation was when we looked at the audit originally for the purposes of our demo. So at this point, I've completed everything that I need for the exception. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. When I do that, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner that it goes ahead and saves the exception. Just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and click Save one more time here on my first screen. And now my exception is live because, as we said before, as of today's date, the exception is now processing in our audit. But of course, whenever you create a new exception, if you've already run a degree audit, you have to understand that the degree audit process is in real time, and it creates a report as of the moment that you request it. So if we requested the report at the beginning of the process, it's not going to show our exception yet because our exception was created before that request was generated. So all I need to do in order to be able to see my exception processing in the audit is if you're in the Advisor Center, I just scroll to the bottom and click Cancel, and it takes me back to the Student Center. I also could have scrolled to the top and clicked on the Student Center link. It would have taken me back to the same place. Academic requirements in this case is already in my academics dropdown, so I'm just going to hit the Go button again. It's going to resubmit the request for my degree audit report and generate that report. Now, if I scroll down here, I can see in my English composition requirement, it went from not satisfied to satisfied. The reason why it did that was because my English composition requirement, if I open it up here, was already satisfied with a course that the student had taken. And if I then open up my intermediate composition, I notice that the detail on that line, the status that tells me if it's satisfied or not satisfied, has actually switched to the word waived to indicate that there's an exception processing, a waiver processing in this space. And the detail that I had typed into my exception is now displayed in the space where the course list and the parameter values for this requirement line used to be. So it's indicating not only on the web-based version, but also on the PDF that this action has taken place in this particular space in the audit, so that it goes ahead and makes that type of waiver. Now, it's important to note as we kind of reach the end of this demonstration that a requirement waiver is sort of an all or nothing proposition. So if you're using this type of exception, you're saying waive everything at this line, or waive everything at this requirement, or waive everything in this group. It is not an exception that can be used to remove hours or remove courses partially from lines or from requirements if they contain lots and lots of bits of information. So if your interest is just to reduce a space in the audit by 1 hour because a course was converted from quarters, you're going to want a different type of exception. You're going to want a requirement change. If your interest in the audit is to eliminate the need for a biology requirement completely, then that's where requirement waiver is going to be your exception type that you're going to want to use. So it's important to kind of distinguish between those two types of exceptions. Now I said before, and I'm just going to go ahead and save my exception again here, make sure I have the student's impl ID, that your description at the top is important because at some point you might be searching for this detail that the student has. And maybe you're doing that because you need to add a new exception, or maybe you're doing that because you need to remove an exception or adjust an exception. Whenever you're doing that type of search, now back on our authorized student exceptions screen, which I got to just by clicking authorized student exceptions in my breadcrumb trail here at the top, I can go to the selection data field and input the student's impl ID and click search. If the student only has one exception associated with them, which is the case for this student, it'll just go ahead and take you right back into that exception. If the student has multiple exceptions associated with them, then just below where your search field is, it's going to list all of the exceptions. So sort of right in this space right here, it'll list all of the exceptions for the student. And to kind of show how that will look, I'll just go ahead and select a plan. And so now it shows me all of the detail that all the exceptions that have been written to this particular plan, because that was the search criterion that I used. But if you would use your selection data and just put in the student simple ID, if it was a student that had multiple exceptions, they would be listed this same way. And you can kind of see the operation code is already present for you, so you know what type of exception is being made, and you have your detail here that's presented to you. So in the case that there are multiple exceptions, you know sort of exactly what is occurring. And in this case, of the students that have exceptions in this particular program, I know that my student is one of them, and I know what kind of exception I'm looking for. So I can look in between the operation code and the description, and I can easily work my way back to the exception that was created for this particular student if I should need to get back to it. So that is requirement waiver.
All right. Thanks, Chad, for everything for that. Sorry about that. Thanks, Chad, for your demonstration. So right now, at this point, we're going to take 5 minutes so he can rest his voice up.